Good morning. Sharing a cup of coffee this morning, waiting for the live notifications to go out, trying to be cognizant of the fact that most mornings I start talking and a few people who like to watch every day miss the beginning because the notifications don't pop up until I'm already talking. So yeah, we're going to kill a little time this morning as an experiment, since you're not watching it. This will most likely be edited out. One minute. Not sure how long this takes. I am going to start doing this a little bit just to see if it makes a difference. It may be me babbling a few moments before 7 o'clock. That's all right. See my cup. Be happy, choose happy. No. What does it say? Think happy, be happy. Think happy, be happy. My growing collection of happiness cups. Okay. Trying to understand the little symbols and what's happening when I'm live. Well, here we go. Good morning and welcome to Brewing Happiness. Grab your cup of coffee or tea or whatever brew you love this morning, and we're going to have a little chat. You know, this morning I thought I would talk about something very near and dear to my heart, and that's fairies. That's right. I have Hazel. Good morning, Hazel. I have been an avid fairy collector since I was a little kid. I don't know why. I talked to fairies when I was a little girl. I loved to draw them. And then as I got older, I started just collecting little fairy things. I don't know. Let's see. I don't know why. I got, like, for instance, this is the top of, she's pretty. It's the top of a jewelry box, right? It's a fairy given to me by a friend. When you collect things, people give you things, right? And then, of course, I have my little fairy snow globe, because I love fairies. And let's see what else I brought. Oh, my garden fairies. This is one that has had better days, but she lives out in the garden. So we usually, you can't see her little broken arm or her rusty wings because she's hidden among some plants. And I have this. Oh, this is my latest fairy. Look here. My brother bought this sent me this for no reason, just as a fun gift. See the fairy? It's a wire sculpture. I've been admiring these giant wire fairy sculptures. And so he got me a little office desk sized one. And she holds a little light that's got a solar lantern in it, so she glows at night. And then I love to build fairy houses. My friends know I am obsessed with fairy houses. They don't last forever because they're made from natural things. And I don't know, I don't finish them well sometimes. They last forever if they live inside. Anyway, I make little fairy houses all the time. This is just my latest one. I don't know why. I live by the rules of, like, I pick up natural things on the ground. I love working with natural. I'm an artist, right? I love working with materials. And the first time I did it, I collected a bunch of sticks and I just stared at the pile of sticks trying to figure out how I could make them into a house. And pretty soon, fairy houses started appearing. So I thought it would be fun today to talk about, fairies. Now, I'm going to be real honest. A lot of the information from this show comes from 2 articles. One's called Lessons from History, A History of Fairies, and the other 5-minute history, a brief history of fairies. So just where you know where I got the information. But in today's world, fairies have been reduced to kind of a little girl's purview, right? They are cartoons and, they're sickly sweet and they have predictably bad behavior and then they get redeemed. It's all fairly formulaic. And I must confess, as a fairyphile, I have loved fairies forever. And again, I do my show and tell of my wonderful fairy collection. I didn't talk even about my books. Let's talk books here. I have, for some reason, collected fairy books. People give them to me, all right, buy them. The Fairy's Guide to Taking Life Lightly. Right? Let's see what we have here. We have Lady Covington's Pressed Fairies. Oh, those are fun. And then a couple more about making clothes for fairies out of flowers and things. And I do make a lot of fairy art. Yeah, they're cool. Yeah, I do love them, right? And history, but see, the thing is, history tells us a much different story about our little fairy friends, right? So we're going to learn a little bit about the history of fairies. It tells a much feature of these creatures, or are they stories? Good morning, Debbie. Talking fairies today. So now, not the word fairy, but creatures analogous to fairies, kind of like fairies, have been incomplete with written and oral literature throughout time. They appeared in Sanskrit, in the Gandharva, in Greek mythology, in Homer. They're in the Jinni of Arabic mythology. So fairies have been in multiple cultures for a long, long time. Now, the word fairy actually rooted in the Latin for fata, meaning fate. Fairies were fate, and in the folk tales were originally that beautiful, slender woman would appear when a baby was born, and they would assign the baby their fate, and then they would fly away. Now, though different cultures have used different names, all these cultures have fairy stories, right? Now, in folklore, they've been defined as mystical creatures, and they have been responsible for both good and evil. Sometimes fairies are depicted as, I forgot my fairy necklace. Pulled out all the fairies today. Anyway, sometimes they could even be depicted as, or they're seen as, mischievous. Now, the origin of the fairy, or what they consider the true origin of fairies, goes back to the Greeks, where they were referred to as nymphs. And the nymphs were tasked with protecting Mother Earth, right? So after all the gods and goddesses were created, God made the nymphs, the tree nymphs, the water nymphs, the sky nymphs, the mountain nymphs, all there to take care of the earth. And they were beautiful, feminine creatures. Masculine versions were called satyrs, S-A-T-Y-R. Not sure how you pronounce that, satyr. Although I have to say, the satyrs mostly depicted as drunken goat men, flute-playing goat men. Just saying. Anyway, the nymphs could do good or bad. And it was always kind of considered that while the angels ruled the heavens, the fairies were responsible for the earthly realm, right? And in medieval times, that's when the first actual fairies, we're calling them fairies, appeared. These appeared in Europe and across the known world. And they were first mentioned, very first time on the actual word a fairy was mentioned, was in the writing of Gervasi of Tilbury. Ricky's great something or other, maybe, right? Anyway, a 12th century scholar, and he was well-traveled, and he traveled to many kingdoms, and he traveled all over the world. And he compiled stories from different kingdoms, from different provinces, and he told stories about unexplained marvels that turned into fairy stories, fairy tales. Anyway, many of these stories had moral lessons, and they talked about being a good Christian or a good person, right? The fairy stories were there to bring about a moral concept. But these days, our perception of fairies, our kids' perception of fairies, they really come from Disney, right? It's from Disney movies or fairy movies, but back in the day, we see the kids movies, right? Little kids movies. But back in the day, fairies were feared. Back in the day, fairies were seen as troublemakers, and the folks took great care not to disturb the fairies. They would divert paths. They would remove corners from the corners of their home. They would build their house so the front door and the back door aligned up perfectly, so that if they had to, open the doors for the fairy folk to fly through. So at this time, though, fairies, they didn't even all have wings, right? The folks people were so scared of fairies during this time that they didn't even say their names. They wouldn't even say the word fairy, right? They called them the little people. And, they took on all kinds of shapes. We might call them today leprechauns, goblins, elves, enchanters, fae, genies, gnomes, pixies. They went by a lot of names, right? So what happened was, over time, the folklore of the little people, the gnomes and the fairies and the elves, mixed with religion. And because back in that day, right, everything had a religion flavor. So they started thinking about these fairies as fallen angels, thrown from heaven for pride and ego, just like you know who. Right? And they became famous because they were not good enough to go to heaven, but bad enough to go to hell, because they were just mischievous. They weren't like evil. And so relegated to the earth. That's how they got relegated to the earthly realm. And that's what they were tasked with, right? And the fairies represented the four matters: the fire, earth, water, and wind. There's writings about them being the protectors, being the stewards of nature, of flowers, of beauty, and of beauty on the earth. Now, you might be saying, but I've never seen a fairy. You might be thinking, well, we really can't see these creatures. Well, they do live with us, but some say they don't live. They live among us, but not with us, in a parallel universe called the realm of Fae. Now, this realm of Fae has apparently been around since those medieval times, and this is the world that the fairies inhabit. Now, what happened here? The story is, as we industrialized the world, the fairies had to go underground, and we pushed them into caves and into burrows and underwater, and finally into the spirit world. I've seen this movie. It was called Fern Gully. A magical, wonderful cartoon movie about fairies. Anyway, that's kind of what happened. And then the story is that then they moved into the mystical, magical, otherworldly dimension and had to move out of the earth. There are stories. I follow a woman named Doreen Virtue, and she is very big on angels and fairies. She is an angel and fairy expert. And I follow a couple people who are convinced that fairies live amongst us today, that the colored orbs we see flying around might be representations of fairies, that they are hidden in nature, and that very, very early in the morning or at dusk, if you are very, very quiet and sit and look long enough, you might see one jumping in and out among the flowers. Now, in the 1900s, a pair of little girls, produced fairy photos that rocked the world. Fairies are real. Fairies are real. Now, if you saw the photos, of today's world, you'd be like, Photoshop. But back in the day, we didn't know, right? Photos were photos. Now, the photos were eventually shown to be. It shows the girls, and they've got these little fairies playing in front of them. And the photos were shown to eventually be fraud. the fairies were identified as coming from a book that was popular at the time, and they were seen to be cutouts. But the sisters insisted on its authenticity for years and years and years, in spite of the evidence that, look, we see these same fairies in a book. And in fact, one sister finally recanted and said, okay, fine, we made it up. But one sister, the younger sister, to her deathbed, was convinced and only talked about the realness of seeing the fairies. Now, there was a twist. They took 5 photos, and they claimed they doctored up 4 of the photos, but the 5th one was real. And I will just say that while translucent, the fairies in the 5th photo looked a lot like the fairies in the other 4 pictures. Just saying. Anyway, little fairy controversy. Anyway, after that, that was the early 1900s. After that, the media got hold of the fairies. And you know what happened next? The fairies moved into cartoons and movies. Famous fairies, right? Novelist James Barrie. Most famous work. You know the one, about a free-spirited boy who could fly, lived in Neverland, never had to grow up. When the first baby laughed for the first time, its laugh broke into 1,000 pieces, and they all went skipping about, and that was the beginning of fairies. And now, when every new baby is born, its first laugh becomes a fairy. So there ought to be one fairy for every girl and every boy. A quote from, you guessed it, Peter Pan. Debbie says, they are real. Well, that's why we're here talking about them, aren't they? Because, you know, obviously, I surround myself with fairies. So why are we still so fascinated? And one more thing. It has been suggested that Barrie's novel might have inspired the elves of Tolkien's Middle-earth. So, those fairies had legs. So why are we still so fascinated with fairy? And by we, I mean I, right? Why am I? But I know I'm not the only one. That's why I say this, is I'm not the only fairy file out there. I got Debbie. They are real. So why are we so fascinated with fairies? It's been suggested because fairy stories or fairy tales usually have a happy ending, right? They're fantasy, not reality. Or maybe because fairies, the idea of fairies, the thought about fairies, take us to a magical place, a place of adventure and mystique and enchantment, right? Everybody loves to get away to Wonderland once in a while. And in this place we struggle, but we always prevail over evil, over bad. Fairies are a creative force. They pique our imagination. They help us daydream, right? They help us move into fantasies. And sometimes that can be so good for us to relax and forget about the world around us and just indulge in fantasy land. Hazel says escapism. Exactly. Nothing wrong with a little healthy escapism and escaping to the land of fairies where they're concerned with keeping nature healthy and the sky's blue and the grass green. And I don't know, fairies are just happy. I think I like fairies because they're happy little creatures, right? They're talking about to young people. They did a study actually and talked to, children love fairies, and they talked to a bunch of young people and they asked why they loved the fairies, and they found that their responses were consistent across demographics, right? Across cultures. They loved them because fairies transported them to another place, and in fairy stories made them feel something, made them feel happy or sad or scared or worried. But children loved the fact that the stories meant something to them. They felt something when they listened to them. Fairies are just a front for fairy tales, right? The world put into stories we can understand, where good might be naive and might wander into trouble, but always wins in the end. We grew up with these tales in so many forms, right? All around us, in stories, in TV shows, in cartoons. We just keep telling. The truth is, we just keep telling these stories over and over again because they're good stories, because they continue to fascinate children, because these are stories that are timeless and are part of our history. most Europeans, and again, almost all other cultures, include stories of fairies, elves, goblins, the little people, in one way or another. They connect us to nature, right? They remind us to protect nature. They remind us that they're there to protect nature. When I do my fairy house, when I make fairy houses, I have a rule. I never break anything off. I only use materials that have already been released by nature, right? Laying on the ground. Because that's what the fairies would want me to do. The fairies wouldn't want me breaking off branches off those trees. We don't do that. Fairies are storytelling, right? They use allegory. They help transport us from as children, they transport us from the scariness of real life to the safe haven of a fairy kingdom, right? Where nothing bad, where bad things happen, but they always turn out good in the end. Playing make-believe allows us, and even little ones, right? Make us and kids, playing make-believes allows us to work out our inner narratives in the safety of somebody else's story, right? This is why fairy tales and stories that have been told through the ages persist, why we're still making movies and still making stories that at the base are the fairy tales that have been around since before any of us can remember, right? Fairies are an inspiration, and they're a great way to pretend. Are they real? You decide, right? Can you see them? I think it's up to you. But protecting the earth is a pretty good message. Leave it undisturbed what you find. And this is a good message for all of us when we're out in nature. Leave it undisturbed. You just don't know who might live there. Today, people don't really believe in mystical creatures or ghosts or anything supernatural. Well, not you. You're here watching the show. You, of course, are here with me believing in magic and magical creatures. But most people, the majority of people these days, they're just relegated to children's fairy tales. And most of us don't take time to sit and hang out with the fairies, right? So that's all I want to do is talk a little bit about fairies. I absolutely have a fairy obsession. I am not sure why. I think it is because I do love to live in the fantasy world. I do love to date. I am a daydreamer from way back when. I'm small, right? I'm a tiny little person. I always thought of myself kind of as a sprite, and the thought of wings and flitting around where no one can really see you. I don't know. Sounds like fun. Sounds like fun to me. Anyway, I'm going to end with a poem I wrote a very long time ago, but I still love so much. And this is a poem that's not published anywhere, by the way. So if you'd like a copy, send me a message and I will send you a copy of this poem. It's called Fairy Time. And it's so old, it's not even on my computer. I'm reading it the old-fashioned way off a piece of paper. When morning mist is yet to clear, the sound of silence all you hear, as dewdrops gently drip from leaves, and sunrise tint with darkness weaves, both smell and color sense sublime, the world's arrived at fairy time. Deep in the forest underglade, beneath each hidden leaf or blade, tiny creatures with wand and wing come out to get the day in swing. Each one performs a daily chore to bring the daytime to the fore. Blossoms open, stems stand straight, commands the winged ones, tasked by fate to bring about the morning splendor. Nature's palette, here to render day drawn from reluctant night, waving wands tucked out of sight. Then once the morning comes to stay, the world is theirs upon to play. Tea with beetles, lunch with elves, nap time taken by themselves, till evening hues adorning sky leave time to ride a butterfly. Once sunset shadows cloak the ground, then hurry while there's still light found, to toadstool homes at Gardens Bend, good nights whispered to kin and friend, to sleep in peace till night time's end, as day renews, begin again. hoping at some point to finish that as a fairy book. Because we love fairy tales. That's the way it is. So, little fairy talk to start you off on your day today. Look around. Look around you as you go on your daily morning walk this morning, as you're sitting in your garden, as you're having your cuppy coffee, as you're having your cup of coffee. Thank you, Debbie. It's one of my favorites. Like I said, I the next one that I have never finished, but it's called Thank You Very Much. It's about being polite, right? About fairy children learning to say thank you very much. Anyway, I think it's a book. I think there's enough fairiness in me to write a whole book about fairies. So as you're about your day today, see if you see any fairies. Magic's all around us if we just open our eyes and look for it. If we're just open to possibilities, you just never know who's going to fly in and land on your shoulder. So that's our story for today. I will be having a guest next Tuesday. I have a friend, Amber Rose, who is a intuitive, and I'm not sure exactly what she does. All kinds of wonderful treatments, and we're gonna talk about it this week as we wait for her to come on next Tuesday, trying to get a schedule where I invite guests on and talk to them. You don't want to just listen to me talk all the time, right? Anyway, that's our show for today. Until tomorrow, find you a fairy. Make it a happy day.